Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar addressing tribal consent, consultation, and wireless infrastructure. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jackie Peda, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Congress of American Indians. We're also joined today by some of our partners. Bambi Kraus, the President of the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, and Kiki Carroll, Executive Director of the United Southern and Eastern Tribes. Together with our organizations, we'll be addressing a critical issue for Indian country, Section 106 and wireless infrastructure. Particularly how tribes review effects to historic properties, cultural resources through the Federal Communications Commission, and wireless infrastructure deployment. We are so pleased that Bambi Kraus of the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers has been working with us on this issue, and also with USET. Some of you might wonder why we just list one regional tribal association, but USET led the effort in 2004 and established the best practices for this effort, which we'd like to use going forward. And we've also used this as an opportunity to talk about the best practices as we talk about the larger permitting issues and tribal solutions. So as I said, Indian country has been having this conversation about infrastructure. As you remember, in the late fall of last year and at our annual meeting, there was quite a lot of conversation about permitting as we were dealing with other permitting issues that were affected in Indian country. And the good part was that in Indian country, all joined together, and throughout the 6 consultations that was had around infrastructure, many tribes engaged and talked about their various individual issues on infrastructure. But one of the things that we all recognized was important for Indian country to be able to have a voice early in the process, and that the recognition of our consent over protections of cultural interest and natural resources on our reservation boundaries was very important to us. And so with that, during that time period, NCAI with a group of technical experts and all of Indian country put forward some really progressive recommendations for the administration to consider regarding how to fix the permitting process to include tribal governments as governments early in the process. In addition to that, the American Council on Historic Preservation released a report on the effects of infrastructure projects on total historic and cultural properties. But we knew when we heard from this president and the presidential election happened, that one of the key pieces was rebuilding America's infrastructure. And with that, there would be continued conversations on how does Indian country engage on the issues of streamlining the infrastructure process. You saw that early after January, when the new administration took over, that there was a presidential memorandum on NATHPO and the executive order on Keystone, and had agency emphasis on streamlining infrastructure projects. Now, the streamlining of infrastructure projects was still happening during the Obama administration, and they had an executive order on streamlining infrastructure projects, which required for tribal input. And yet we didn't see the kind of process that allowed for that input. Part of our recommendations was to ensure that tribal governments had input early into the permitting processes. What we really want to make sure doesn't happen is we don't want Indian country to be seen as a barrier to development in development, particularly in Indian country and adjacent to Indian country. But clearly, like any other government, tribes have the right to be able to be involved in the process and provide consent on any of the issues that may impact their tribal land. That's why this particular webinar and this notice of the streamlining of infrastructure decisions with the FCC is so important. Because this is the first time since the new administration came in that tribal governments will have the opportunity to provide comments on the effects of the draft notice of proposed rulemaking by the FCC but clearly on the first level of streamlining infrastructure for infrastructure process for review. Just going over the FCC Commission for a minute here. Excuse me. The FCC Commission has new leadership. The resignation of Chairman Tom Wheeler in January, President Trump appointed Commissioner Pai to serve as chairman. Commissioner Pai's first remarks were addressing the digital divide that exists in America, especially in rural and tribal lands. And we were very pleased to be able to hear his comments. And he mentioned he hopes to be able to bridge the digital divide by deploying new infrastructure across Indian countries. Well, part of this effort includes streamlining the perceived hurdles to deployment, like moving the federal, state, and local regulations. Early when Commissioner Pai was appointed, he met with us and we had early meetings. President Clousby came to DC. We were able to engage with him. And our team and their team have been having regular conversations because we knew that the tribal section 106 review was a piece to the puzzle. And Indian country clearly supports deployment, but we also want to retain our sovereignty over the review process, particularly as it protects our sacred sites on and off reservation. Just like a lot of folks in rural America and other areas, Indian country needs wireless deployment. And we really want to be able to make sure that the Indian country get the access they need to high-speed internet. Just to remember that the FCC is part of the federal government and still carries the responsibility of that trust responsibility to tribes, which is so important to help us close the divide, but also provide the high-speed internet to people who live on tribal lands and to be able to consult with tribal governments when it deals with the infrastructure permitting process. This is really important, especially when we wanted to set the framework. Our early conversations with the FCC was being able to share with the FCC what some of the best practices look like and what some of the concerns were, so that we were better able to help inform and to develop the consultation structure. And that's one of the reasons why it's so imperative that Indian country drive the conversation. What happens to infrastructure consultation is really important for us. We don't, as I said earlier, don't want to be seen as the barrier, but it is very, very important that as we come together with industry, with the federal government, and even sometimes when they defer to the state government, that the tribal solutions and tribal recommendations and the tribal voice doesn't get lost. That we have to be able to make sure that all the parties recognize how important it is for tribes to have consent on infrastructure projects, and particularly those that affect our sacred and cultural protected sites. So with this, as we deliberate this issue and provide comments to the FCC, I hope we in Indian country will also gather together and be able to put together some of the best practices and solutions to be able to make sure that we have an efficient process where we are very responsive to the needs of industry as we go through this effort, and still ensure that Indian country's voice is clearly heard. So to illustrate this point, our partners at USET have created the following video that outlines the tower construction over to our NCAI policy analyst, Maria Gibbons. She will go into the specifics of the draft notice and how Indian country can respond.
Indian country wants to protect TC&S and tribal consultation. As the communications industry expands access to broadband and cellular services, required infrastructure is being installed across the U.S., including areas of religious and cultural significance to a historic property, regardless of the location of that property. Indian Country supports wireless technology. However, 41% of tribal lands do not have access to broadband, leaving 1.5 million people without this technology. In accordance with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, the FCC is required to consult with tribal nations on federal undertakings, including the licensing of cell towers and other telecommunications infrastructure to preserve historic and cultural sites. The Tower Construction Notification System, TCNS, is an online system that notifies tribal nations of proposed communications tower constructions in areas of interest designated by that tribal nation. The TCNS respects tribal sovereignty by providing a means for tribal nations to respond in an expedited fashion directly to the companies as to whether they have concerns about the proposed tower construction. The TCNS is intended to advance the goal of the National Historic Preservation Act to protect historic properties in an efficient and convenient manner that promotes the interest of both tribal nations and the communications industry. Tribal nations have a unique expertise in the evaluation of impacts that affect tribal interest. This expertise is of great benefit to the FCC and the communications industry, which justifies payment of reasonable fees to tribal nations. Accessing this tribal expertise to benefit a commercial enterprise is a wholly separate issue from a tribal nation invoking its right to consult with the FCC. The communications industry is moving away from cellular towers and moving towards small nodes that can be attached to buildings, light poles, and utility poles, as well as installing new structures in order to prepare for 5G. 5G is the term used to describe the next generation of mobile networks that will be blazing fast. The build-out of 5G technologies should not come at the expense of the desecration of sacred sites or consultation avoidance. Indian Country is excited about the prospect of this new technology and hopes for 5G and earlier generations of wireless to be deployed on reservations. The communications industry has been telling the FCC that they don't want to pay such high fees for different types of infrastructure, and TCNS is too slow of a process and requires too much research. After hearing from the communications industry, the FCC is attempting to revise TCNS through a draft Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, so tribes may not be able to review 5G nodes before installation. TCNS has helped preserve and protect tribal sacred sites, burial sites, and landscapes. It also helps the communications industry meet its obligations under federal law. Indian Country strongly supports the TCNS model and believes that reasonable fees are essential for tribal nations to conduct evaluations of proposed constructions, which also benefits the communications industry. Tribal fees are necessary for tribes and tribal historic preservation officers to fully evaluate the impacts to historic properties and cultural resources protected by Section 106. Indian Country is seeking official tribal consultation on this issue and requests that the FCC support tribal efforts to resolve any outstanding issues. Indian Country needs to file comments with the FCC for their voice to be heard. Without proper consultation, tribal nations could fall victim to expedited permitting by the communications industry. Indian Country wants the FCC to honor the government-to-government relationship and work with tribal nations to protect the TCNS program and to discourage elements within the communications industry from undercutting the proven benefits of the TCNS for both industry and tribal nations. This potential action by the FCC to change the intent of the TCNS could establish a bad precedent moving forward and open the door to other federal actions that would undermine or dismiss our tribal sovereignty and interest. Engage now! Indian Country needs to file comments with the FCC by April 18th. Make your voice heard!
real notice of proposed rulemaking. These notices signal the Commission's intent to change existing rules while soliciting public comment. This draft notice addresses tribal issues and tribal consultation under Section 106 in a variety of ways. It looks for a more standardized and streamlined process for tribal fees, aims to streamline the time for tribal review for applications, get clarification on what types of sites tribes can review, and solicits comments on all of these aspects. So first I'll dive into tribal fees. Here are a few examples of the questions asked about tribal fees. How does tribal sovereignty and treaty obligations affect FCC action? At what point, if any, might a tribal nation act as a contractor or consultant? One big aspect of the TCNS process the industry has difficulty with is large areas of tribal interest. Tribes put their areas of interest into TCNS based off of the tribe's knowledge of their geographic homelands and territories. The draft NPRM asks, should tribes be required to provide certification for defining their areas of interest? We've heard from many tribes that this is the wrong way to approach the situation. They have relayed to us that certifying your heritage like this goes against tribal sovereignty. The draft NPRM also asks if industry applicants can self-certify their Section 106 compliance. This is in direct conflict with the government-to-government relationship between tribes and the FCC, and would gut the purpose of the Section 106 review process. The FCC is also considering implementing a deemed granted protocol to grant applications after a tribe has not responded in a certain amount of time. The FCC is seeking to implement a new fee schedule to limit tribes from charging fees that they determine are necessary. Another aspect that we're concerned about in the FCC draft notice is when multiple tribes have the same geographic interest and review the same application. This situation requires more than one tribe to review one application. They're looking to streamline this process by limiting each tribe's input. They ask if fees should be lower in this instance, and also ask if one tribe should be represented at site visits or site monitoring. Again, we have heard from tribes that this questions the sovereignty of individual tribes, making individual decisions as governments. It is easier for industry applicants to have one point of contact, meaning only working with one tribe in this situation. The system that was originally set up has changed as tribes have learned more about their cultural history and areas of interest. Tribes have built more capacity and have become more engaged in the TCNS process. For these very large companies, changes in process like this can make big financial impacts for the company. It is imperative for tribes to respond to this by answering the following. Explain what the fee structure looks like for your tribe. Explain why fees are necessary for review. What is a fee schedule that you could work with? Highlight times where industry did not act in good faith. The FCC has heard from applicants that a few tribes have taken advantage of the Section 106 TCNS review process by increasing fees in areas of interest, leading to increased revenue for the tribe. The FCC has listened to this concern by industry and wants to address it by changing the rules for all tribes. That is why it's important to discuss in our comments when industry has not always acted in good faith. It is so important to note that there are many reasons why applicant self-certification could undermine the 106 review process. By noting when industry wasn't a good partner and didn't act in good faith, this will let the FCC know that it is not a viable remedy. Some tribes have said that the reason why they charge upfront payments is because applicants have refused to pay in the past after the work has been completed. If that has happened to your tribe, be sure to put that in your comments. It's important to articulate why tribal areas of interest change. By looking at what's in this draft notice, the non-tribal stakeholders don't understand why this happens, and Indian country needs to educate on this topic. It's also important to highlight the tribal sovereignty of individual tribes. States and other governments are treated as individuals, and Indian country's response needs to notice the need to highlight that. The next big topic in the draft notice addresses how long it takes for tribes to review applications through TCNS. The notice asks, should the FCC take new measures to speed up the time of tribal review? And if there is no tribal response after a certain amount of time, should applicants be able to self-certify their Section 106 compliance? I mentioned this was tribal fees, but it is an underlying thread of this notice, and the intent of the National Historic Preservation Act is to prevent this from happening. It also sets up the deemed granted framework for tribes to be further removed from the process. Industry claims that the average time for tribal review is 114 days. Many tribes that we've been talking to say their average is a lot closer to 30 days. The FCC National Programmatic Agreement outlines a 30-day review, and USET member tribes have around a 45-day process that they have agreed to in their 2004 best practices. The other side of this coin is incomplete applications submitted by industry. When tribes do not have all the information they need from industry, there are delays in tribal review. Industry claims that tribal review slows deployment. And again, when submitting comments, Indian Country can respond to this section by reporting the average time your tribe takes to review. In your opinion, what is a reasonable time for tribal review? Explain situations that create delays. What are practices of industry that causes delays? How often do you receive incomplete packets? Explain information that is needed for a complete review, and highlight the responsiveness of applicants. The draft notice of proposed rulemaking also looks into the types and sites of technology that tribes will be eligible to review. The video talked a lot about small cells, and industry wants to deploy in rights-of-way, co-locate on existing towers, and replace poles, all without Section 106 review. First, I'll talk about collocations. Collocation simply means putting new technology on an existing tower. And the draft NPRM asks if collocations should be excluded from tribal review. Should tribes be engaged in this process at all? Do collocations impact historic properties? From industry's perspective, most of the 5G rollout will be in collocations starting at the end of this year. They'll be on existing poles or buildings. Industry is proposing that existing towers have already gone through the 106 process, and since they don't turn up dirt, they should be exempt from tribal review. Existing rules also limit tribal involvement in collocations. Because of the nature of this technology, tribes may see this as an area of potential compromise. Indian Country can respond to this section on collocations by noting if collocations do impact historic and cultural properties. When do you believe that tribal review is necessary for collocations? Would you support batching the review of many sites into one application? Also, it's important to address twilight towers. They have never gone through the Section 106 process because they were built before the FCC rules require tribal review through 106. The last major aspect of the draft notice I want to discuss is deploying in rights-of-way. The Notice of Proposed Rulemaking asks if all rights-of-way should be excluded from Section 106 review, regardless of whether the right-of-way is located on a historic property. For example, if a known burial site exists in a right-of-way, under this proposed exclusion, industry could dig and build a tower on or near a known burial area. Tribes have expressed serious concern about this section. The right-of-ways they're talking about are areas that were historical trails hundreds of years ago. But this is also where deployment is most needed. The NPRM asks how any new exclusion for rights-of-way need to address tribal participation, especially regarding archaeological aspects. Because the FCC is open to changing its rules like this, it is so important for Indian Country to remind them of their responsibility to protect our sacred sites. Industry sees rights-of-way as an unfair situation. The telephone and electrical companies can develop in rights-of-way without the 106 process. But because developing wireless spectrum is a federal undertaking, they are the only industry that's required to do this. They also see these areas as already developed. Like I mentioned earlier, the greatest need for wireless technology exists near these rural highways. It is also the easiest place for industry to deploy, making it one of their first priorities. Indian Country can respond by explaining the history of these heavily trafficked areas that are now highways. The interstate highway system was built 10 years before the National Historic Preservation Act was passed, meaning that the original highways were not reviewed under Section 106 by tribes. This is why it's so important to review now. The biggest point tribes may want to include in their comments is that the intent of the National Historic Preservation Act is in direct conflict with these sweeping right-of-way exclusions. The law is clear that developing on top of a historical and cultural property is illegal, and the FCC's language excluding tribal input, regardless of whether a right-of-way is located on a historic property, is in direct conflict with that law. In summary, I wanted to share some language taken directly from the draft notice that may be of particular concern for tribes and TIPOs. At what point in the TCNS process, if any, might a tribal nation act as a contractor or consultant? It's not the existence of fees, but instead the amount of compensation sought by some tribal nations. Should rules be revised in a manner that would permit applicants to self-certify their Section 106 compliance? When is it necessary for an applicant to compensate multiple tribal nations for the same project? How does due regard for tribal sovereignty and the government's treaty obligations affect our latitude for action? Should we require some form of certification for tribal areas of interest? And what would be the default if a tribal nation fails to provide such certification? This is why it's so important for tribes to respond. We need to have a clear message that says the FCC has an obligation to consult with tribes on major changes in the TCNS process. Sovereign governments can charge fees for government services, just like state and local preservation officers do. Accessing tribal expertise to identify historic properties to benefit an industry is a completely separate issue than the tribe's right to consult with the federal government. Tribal nations are the only parties who can determine adverse effects to their cultural and religious properties. And only individual tribes themselves can determine the potential impacts to their own protected properties. NCAI, USET, and NATHPO will prepare draft comments to be used as a model for this process. Make sure to comment on the draft notice by April 18th. You can submit comments through the FCC electronic comment filing system. Who should file comments? Tribal governments, regional organizations, TIPOs, and culture departments, as well as telecom experts in their IT departments. Again, make sure to engage at every stage. Step 1 is filing comments on the draft by April 18th. Step 2 is filing comments when it is an official notice of proposed rulemaking. You'll have 30 days to comment after it's been on the Federal Register. An interesting aspect of the FCC process is reply comments. You have 60 days to reply to any comment on the docket. We can rebut false claims by other commenters, support other tribes and organizations by filing a reply comment. The next step after this webinar is to take a look at the questions posed in the draft notice. NCAI has put those together in the document that is in the handout section of this webinar. The next step is to write and submit your own comments. After that, encourage partners and other tribes to submit comments on this. Now we'd like to turn it over to our partners on this project, USET and NATHPO.
Good afternoon. This is Kitty Carroll with United South and Eastern Tribes. Just a couple of comments that I want to make on behalf of our organization. And I want to start specifically with our USET FCC Voluntary Best Practices Agreement that we signed over a dozen years ago. I want to make clear that everybody on the call understands that that is an agreement that exists between the tribal nations within our region and the FCC. If there were to be interest in this best practices model that we use, of course, that would have to go out to the rest of Indian country for consideration, review, and proper consultation. I reference that because it was mentioned in a PowerPoint. It's been referenced in many of our conversations. I want to make sure that everybody is absolutely crystal clear on that. But one of the other reasons why I want to raise the best practices agreement is it became very clear in our conversations between industry, our organizations, and the FCC that a lot of the challenges that they were putting forward had already been thought through over a dozen years ago. Our best practices thought those through, and it was very clear and evident that a lot of people weren't even aware of the language within that best practices agreement. So as our conversations with industry unfolded and we brought this document back into the mix, we took the position that a lot of the frustrations, a lot of the concerns the industry was putting forward had already been contemplated over a dozen years ago, which is the fact that people had forgotten that that language already existed. So for our organization, as we've been communicating with the FCC, we've been referring back to that very document as a means to respond to a lot of the thoughts, questions, and considerations that industry has put forward. I will also remind everybody that the best practices agreement was an effort to streamline the process. It was an effort to recognize that the need to consult on every single cell tower may become cumbersome. So this was an effort to work in partnership. But we always held out that if this best practices model did not work, that consultation was the option. So as we're contemplating this new 5G technology, our organization does have concerns that the number of placements will be exacerbated or increased in terms of the older technology, the 3G and the 4G technology. The reason why our organization is so concerned about this is to underscore what Jackie Johnson said at the beginning of this webinar, is that we believe that if Indian country does not engage on this, that it will open the door and open the floodgates if we don't engage properly. So part of our desire for having a few moments during today's webinar was to underscore for everybody the importance of engaging on this issue. And we do recognize that unless you are a TIFO or somebody who actively engages in these issues, this is a complex issue. So we try to simplify it down to its basic elements. But bottom line, this is an issue of consultation, of including tribes at the very beginning, of not avoiding consultation, of protecting sites of cultural and religious interest and importance to us. So we implore everybody on this call, and for those of you to share with your other colleagues and partners, to make sure that they engage so the federal government and the FCC hears that we are watching this and that we are aware and that we have an effort to improve this process. And that's the position that we've been taking all along, is that we recognize that the technology has changed. Although that being said, we know that there are areas in any country that still use that old technology, and this would all still apply, but for where the areas of the 5G technology is being placed, as Jackie mentioned in her earlier comments, we want that same access as well, but not at the expense of consultation, not at the expense of our sovereignty, and not at the expense of those sites that are religious and cultural importance to us. I think that's all I'll offer for this moment right now. If anybody does have any questions about our best practices agreement that we have with the FCC, we'd be more than happy to share that with other regions who are interested in maybe contemplating such a similar model with the FCC, but we'll see. Okay.
And just to note that a copy of the USET best practices is in the handout section of this webinar. So if you want to take a look at it, you can look at the handout. And before we go to our next partner, I just wanted to remind you all to raise your hands on the screen if you have a question, or you can type it into the question box for our Q&A session coming up soon. So Bambi, if you would like to give us a brief update, or just want to stress why this process is so important, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to NCAI for organizing this. Not to rehash everything that's already been said, I think the key here is the changing technology and where the big providers are looking to make a lot of money for a lot of reasons. We're not against that. We hope that Indian country can take advantage of some of the new technology coming. But in terms of this notice of proposed rulemaking, they've built an excellent administrative record of how tribes have not fit into their financial model. And it's imperative that tribes comment on a number of issues, but what's not included are the tribal success stories. There are many examples of how tribes they feel have not worked within the system, and it's been pretty ad hoc for a lot of different reasons, but they're coming to strengthen the system from an industry point of view. So for example, industry wants to install a lot of small objects, mostly in urban areas, as quickly as possible. And they've identified that their people who will be buying their services are in urban areas, and they can install a lot of the technology that they need to provide them services for a lot of wireless issues, like for example, a wireless mouse, streaming live video on Facebook, all those things that people are starting to use more. The industry carriers think that the fastest way to make this possible is to put their technology on existing structures and within right-of-ways. So that's how they plan on deploying as many small objects as possible. And we all know that Indian country is not one size fits all. So what they've done, though, is in this administrative record, they've conflated the concepts of their new towers still going to be made. They're going to be putting in new poles, perhaps not as big as the ones in the past, as the past towers, but a lot of technology that hasn't been described to anybody in Indian country in a way that allows us to really understand what they're trying to do. And they're trying to develop some of this 5G technology also. So if you feel like you don't really know what's being discussed when it comes to 5G, there's a good reason for that. It's just not existing yet, and a lot of it is internal to the industry components. And the other thing that's conflated in the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking that is of great concern to tribes is that TCNS is tower construction notification. Part of that is tribal consultation, and this Notice of Proposed Rulemaking includes the role of a tribe as a contractor or a consultant, which is how a tribe is able to collect fees for their time. And we've all been able to support tribes to get fees for the work that they've been doing to help push along the deployment of wireless technology, mostly in the form of towers, but now in the form of these small objects. So if you conflate notification, tribal consultation, and a tribe serving in the role as a contractor or consultant, it does get confusing. And they're looking to make sharp distinctions on when does one stop and the other start. So just two last points is that since the record doesn't include any tribal success stories, NATHPO is encouraging the TIPOs and the TCNS tribes to, at least for this first phase of the consultation process, to bring out your success stories. We've heard anecdotally a lot about how a tribe has been able to work with the TCNS system and to move the siting of a cell tower so that it doesn't impact a sacred site. There's no reporting mechanism in place at the FCC or at NATHPO or anywhere that would keep that on the book so that everybody knew TCNS is working. So we are left to defend ourselves by bringing out our success stories because they're not being told. And the administrative record is strong on instances where the tribes, the industry feels, have not been a good collaborator with the industry themselves. And then I just want to say that some tribes are looking to get an individual agreement to get around this one-size-fits-all. And it's a concept that I think is worth investigating and exploring. And that's one thing the proposed rulemaking is said to be is seeking comments on, is if you think that you have a proposal that's not in the parameters of this notice, perhaps you can share that with us. So thank you very much, NCAI, and I'm available to answer any questions.
Great, thank you, Bambi. So now we're going to open it up to questions from our participants. Just a reminder, you can type in a question onto the webinar, or you can raise your hand. And my colleague Denise Desiderio is going to start.
So our first question is, when will NCAI, USET, and NATHPO share their the draft template for comments? And I'll let Bambi answer for NATHPO. I know that USET NCAI plan on having their comments done by the 13th so that we can send it out to tribal leaders and tribal orgs and others to use as a model or to sign on as group commenters. So that we'll have those done. We'll send it to everybody who's on this webinar. We'll also put it out to our broadcast system. So that will be Thursday the 13th with the goal of having the comments done and filed by this April 18th. The second comment we have is why are we commenting on the draft notice of proposed rulemaking instead of just waiting for the notice of proposed rulemaking? And the reason is that we've learned from the FCC that the commissioners will be considering changes to this draft rulemaking right up until the time that they vote on it. So we think it's really important to have a very strong showing from Indian country on the areas that we're concerned about, in the hopes that there will be some of these, that maybe some of the more troubling provisions could be revised by then. And we think that it's a good opportunity to have an early voice on this matter. Okay, and we have a question from Andrea Alexander, and your line is unmuted.
Yeah, hi, thank you. My name is Andrea Alexander. I'm a Makah tribal member from Washington State. And the question, I know that industry has approached the state of Washington through Senator John McCoy to get support at the state level for moving forward with 5G, and he wouldn't let it get past his committee here in our state. But the question is, for the many tribes in rural areas that don't even have 4G in place, that's a big problem. And the other issue that I've seen is that many tribal councils don't have even the background information of leases that are in place by energy or telecom companies because they're so old and not existent. The documents sort of don't even exist anymore. The changes with the BIA Realty Department and then tribes going self-governance. So we see a lot of trespass all over Indian country because we don't have current leases. So I don't know if that's come up in any of your discussions, but I would just like to raise that as just a strategy for discussion so that we can address the tribes that, again, do not have sort of the background information, because I agree, thank you, it's a technical issue that a lot of leaders haven't been involved in at this point. So thank you very much. It's a really good webinar, and I really appreciate your leadership here.
Thanks, Andrea.
So if there are any more questions, please raise your hand or type it into the questions portion of the webinar.
Well, this is Bambi at NATHPO. So while we wait for another question, in terms of NATHPO's strategy, I'm hoping that some tribes can submit some success stories prior to the April 20th meeting, hopefully by April 13th. And there will be time to continue to add to the administrative record, and the comments can be further refined and additional information added in the proposed rulemaking period and then afterwards.
And we do have another question. The question is, will there be any new meetings with the commissioner? And the answer to that is that yes, we are always looking to engage with the commissioner and the other, with the chairman and the other commissioners. We did have early meetings. We've not had any meetings or conversations since this draft rulemaking came out, but we have put in a request to meet or have our leadership meet with the commissioner, with the commission. And we've also invited the chairman to come to our mid-year session so that he can meet with tribal leaders directly and engage with tribal leaders directly. We think that when we do meet with him, he seems to have an interest in how broadband deployment is impacting rural communities and tribes. So we're hoping that if we can get him in front of a lot of tribal leaders and engaging with us, that he will have a greater understanding and that potentially we can head off some of these issues earlier. So yes, we are still trying to engage with the commission.
And just to add to that, in the draft notice of proposed rulemaking, they do ask, should the commission continue meeting with tribal associations, tribal nations on this topic? And the FCC is asking yes or no, should they? And if you believe that the FCC should still continue to meet with tribes, you should definitely comment and address that in your comments.
I want to offer one point of clarification to that language that was included. So USET, NCAI, and NATHPO started engaging these conversations directly with the FCC and industry towards late summer or early fall of last year. We were very clear with them from day one that we were not speaking on behalf of the tribal nations. Our role was to help guide them and educate them about what Indian country's interests were in this area, but ultimately if there was going to be changes coming down the road that they had an obligation to consult with tribes directly. But our main goal and focus is to make sure that they were educated about Indian country and knew how to navigate within the confines of Indian country most appropriately and respectfully. Ultimately pushing them all the time to a place where they know that they have to consult and making sure that FCC fulfills its responsibilities. And basically that, I spoke to the USET best practices document earlier in our discussion, my own comments, excuse me. That's really what that was. It was about to facilitate the Commission's compliance with its obligations under NEPA, to facilitate the applicant's compliance with their obligations under NEPA and the Commission rules, and to ensure that tribal interest in the preservation of properties of religious and cultural significance to tribes listed in or eligible for listing in the National Register are identified or taken into account early in the process. And I wanted to just underscore that early in the process. That's what this is really about for us. We all just have heard the situation and how it unfolded specific to Standing Rock and DAPL, and how engagement wasn't the answer for early in the process, and that was a failure on the part of the federal players within that. So this is an opportunity for us to ensure that we are engaged early in the process, to make sure that sightings, whether they are co-locations or whether they're new locations, that tribes are involved from the very beginning. And that's what they need to hear from you. That's what needs to be expressed by every tribe across this country, that is what we are expecting. So please, what we're looking for is full engagement and participation on this issue. We are fearful of that if the FCC just gets a handful or a small number of submissions, that they're going to see that or take that as Indian country not taking this seriously. We need to let our voice be heard in this moment so that we can set the record from the very beginning, whether it's the FCC or in other situations down the road.
And this is Denise. I just want to kind of add on to what Kiki said, because we have a question about whether we can explain why or how the presidential memorandum on DAPL and the executive order on Keystone proceeded despite the many tribes who objected. And I think, as Jackie mentioned when we first started this webinar, our main concern is that our voice won't be strong enough. I know that the president made a statement when he signed the executive order on DAPL that they hadn't heard from any tribes, and I think it's our goal to never let anyone say that again. This really is the first infrastructure process at a federal agency since the executive order and presidential memorandum have been signed. We expect that other agencies are also looking at ways to streamline infrastructure projects, so this is our first opportunity. And I just want to echo what Kiki said, that we have to be fully engaged early, often, and consistently. And that brings me to my the other question is, did the chairman commit to the mid-year? No, he hasn't committed yet. We sent that invitation out, I think, 2 weeks ago to the FCC, and we will check back, and we will make sure that we keep asking. I think that early on when he met with President Clattersby, he did indicate that he would like to come to the mid-year session, so we are hopeful that he can be there. We have another question, and the question is on how the FirstNet construction and build-out will be coordinated with the mandates of this rulemaking, and I'm going to have Maria answer that question.
Yeah, so FirstNet is a newer agency. It's a semi-independent agency housed within the Department of Commerce, and the FCC is a fully independent agency that is not under any other umbrella. And FirstNet is the first responders network, and it will build a network of telecommunications infrastructure across the entire United States that will connect first responders, police officers, EMTs, emergency services with one another, so that if an emergency happens, the network doesn't get overloaded, and that those first responders are able to communicate with each other. But going back to what the question was, will the FirstNet build out be coordinated in a mandate of this rulemaking? This rulemaking is only for spectrum licensed by the Federal Communications Commission. Again, it's an independent agency within the federal government, and FirstNet is outside of the scope of this FCC rulemaking.
And we have a question or comment from Greg Smith. Greg, you're unmuted. You can go. Greg, it shows that you're self-muted, so can you unmute, and we're anxious to hear your question. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yep, there we go.
Oh, there we go. Okay, I have two different mute buttons on my phone, one for the webinar. I just wanted to add a short comment that the National Historic Preservation Act is a statute of tremendous importance to Indian country because it's the one act that allows Indian country to have a say when a private actor acting on private land is affecting an Indian interest. Now, it allows that say if there's also a fence shaking. So, of course, in this case of the cell towers, a lot of these towers are on private land built by private actors. If they weren't transmitting, well, there's nothing we could do. Indian interests wouldn't be addressed. But because they
Greg, I'm sorry. I think you cut out on us for a few minutes. Let me see if there are any other questions while we wait for Greg to come back.
I had something to add to the importance of this rulemaking. If we have a minute here until we hear from Greg.
Yes, I think we have 2 minutes left in the webinar.
Right. So what's interesting in this Notice of Proposed Rulemaking is that they're actually requested a couple of times what other federal agencies think about the issues that are being laid out in this particular docket. And I, have never really seen that in a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. Usually there's an internal federal family process where if someone's proposing something big, they might share it with other agencies that are affected or would participate. And the reason why we've been holding up the TC&S process as something to emulate for other federal agencies is because it is already a streamlining process. And actually TC&S may not apply to a lot of other federal agencies. Only the Federal Communications Commission has devoted the staff and resources to really make TC&S something that worked. So I don't know how you could use this model for another federal agency. Land managing agencies would have different issues than the permitting and licensing process of the FCC. But the fact that they're looking for other federal agency comments is peculiar from my point of view.
Bambi, thank you for sharing that. I think you just raised the latter part of that aside for a second. The fact that the FCC over a dozen years ago set forth this model was ahead of its time. I think one of the things that would be advantageous for the FCC, and particularly the chairman, to hear right now is that there is an opportunity once again for FCC to continue that pattern. So there may be challenges with the TC&S system. There may be ways to update that TC&S model in a way that reflects the changing technology. What we've heard from our TIPOs and our member tribal nations is that they are open to those types of discussions with the intent of still keeping a streamlined process for the benefit of the FCC and industry, but also for our interest as well. Where our concern comes in is a reverse of course, where they would make changes to the TCS model that would be disadvantageous, or whether it would completely go out the window. So we are hopeful, and what we are saying to the FCC is for them to once again take hold of this opportunity to show that they are ahead of the game, that they can demonstrate how to work in partnership with tribal nations and with industry for the benefit of us all, and then hopefully for other federal departments and agencies to aspire to emulate that. So thank you for raising that, because that reminded me that's a very strong point to make.
Thank you. Actually, we have heard from a participant about FirstNet. The FCC and FirstNet actually signed an MOU for NEPA and Section 106 compliance. And FirstNet will be utilizing the FCC's TCNS system. Paragraph 14 of the signed MOU stated that FirstNet shall utilize the FCC's tower construction notification system as appropriate in order to effectively and efficiently notify tribal nations of all covered activities. So this proceeding would actually impact FirstNet deployment, as they're also focused on pursuing co-locations as much as possible instead of building out new infrastructure as a cost-saving mechanism. So to answer the earlier question about FirstNet, FirstNet will be using the TCNS system in their next build-out. And I think that was our last question. You can, if you have any further questions about this webinar, you can contact me, Maria Gibbons, at mgibbons@ncai.org, Bambi Kraus at bambi@nathpo.org, and for USET, you can contact Liz Malerba at lmalerba@usetinc.org. And this webinar will be posted later again, and you will also get a webinar follow-up email including text of the draft notice of proposed rulemaking, text of the USET best practices, and of some NCAI documents relating to the issue. So thank you for joining us.